Thank you, Simone, and thank you for inviting me today to present on this. I hope, for those of you attending, that this will be useful, particularly if you are thinking about or undertaking studies within a trial at the moment. As we all, I'm sure, well know, recruitment and retention are key components of trials, but remain challenging. This is a theme that we've seen over a number of years now, and there doesn't seem to be a huge shift in the improvement of that. So a recent review found that about 37% of trials didn't recruit to the required sample size. Previous work suggests that around 25% of trials experience attrition of greater than 10%. So this is still an issue, and those similar themes have been available and ongoing in the literature, as I say, over a number of years. There are also challenges, again, as I'm sure you well know, with other trial processes, so things like data collection and the quality of that data, recruiting and retaining an inclusive group of patients, or perhaps ensuring inclusivity in a patient and public involvement group, difficulties around qualitative components of trials, of intervention adherence, and of data analysis methods are all present as well. Collectively, those challenges are or can contribute to research waste. And that continues to be a significant problem, and is something that we need to think about trying to address in the way that we conduct our trials and report our trials, so that we can minimise that going forward. Despite the difficulties and the issue with research waste, there is limited evidence to support trial process decisions, so things like recruitment, retention, data collection, and so on. You may be familiar with previous Cochrane reviews by Sean Truick for recruitment and Katie Gillies for retention. So they focus specifically on those components, but the evidence base for other processes is significantly much more limited. And I always like to come to this quote when I talk about SWATs and their importance. I think this really kind of, it nails it, in that we spend a lot of time when we're designing trials ensuring that we generate the evidence for patient outcomes, but how we actually do that is really quite anecdotal. Essentially, we do what we think works. We rely on experience and judgment. But what about if those things that we're just doing because it's something we've done before and we think that it works are actually really having a negative effect when we drill down into it a little bit more? And a good example of that is around Christmas cards. We undertook a study within a trial, or a SWAT, looking at these across a number of different trials all at the same time. Many teams were sending these out to participants every year without fail, but actually there is no evidence that they make any difference in patients returning or responding to questionnaires or engaging with follow-up appointments. Therefore, we need methods like studies within a trial to offer us a robust way to evaluate trial processes and to try and move away from the anecdotal idea of conduct into something that's more evidence-based. So as a reminder, for those that are unaware of what studies within a trial are, so these are a relatively new method, but are increasing. Here in the University of York, we've been undertaking SWATs now for the last 20 or so years, with the aim of adding to evidence base for trial methodology, particularly around recruitment and retention of trial participants. So a SWAT itself is a self-contained research study embedded within a host trial. And these might also be known as nested trials, trials within trials, or embedded trials. So you may have heard some of that terminology in the literature, or even use it yourselves. So SWATs are designed to test interventions to improve the conduct of a trial within an ongoing trial. There are other similar types of evaluation, so things like trials within a cohort, or TWICs, studies within a review, or SWORs, and studies within a project, SWOPs. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on studies within a trial, SWATs. So SWATs primarily evaluate or explore the design or the delivery, or organisation of trial processes. So test trial process alternatives, for example, different data collection strategies, or explore why processes happen as they do, for example, reasons for patients non-consenting. The focus is often on recruitment or retention, but as I said, we can focus on any stage or process within that. SWOTs can be randomised or non-randomised, and that very much depends on the question. Clearly, a randomised SWOT is far better for comparing, say, the effectiveness of a different type of information sheet versus a standard information sheet, whereas a non-randomised design for exploring trial processes through qualitative means is largely the better option. We can also complete SWOTs in a number of different ways. So individually in a single trial, and that's really the most common way that people complete SWOTs. But we can also do these in a more coordinated fashion, where the same SWOT is undertaken in multiple trials over a set period or via a staged approach, or even, as in the case of the Christmas cards that I mentioned earlier, a coordinated and simultaneous approach where we undertake this study within a trial at the same time in a number of studies. The current evidence for SWOTs, as I'm sure you've gathered from my presentation so far, really do focus on recruitment and retention strategies. In the literature, there are only, from the review by Truique et al., only 3 recruitment strategies with high certainty evidence. So using open design versus blinding design, telephone reminders to contact non-responders on receipt of an information sheet and consent approach, both of which potentially look to increase recruitment, and an optimised patient information sheet, which looks to have little or no difference. There is an ongoing update to this at the moment by colleagues based at the York Trials Unit. Similarly with retention, there's no high certainty evidence at all for any retention strategies, and whilst there are a number of strategies with moderate certainty, there's even one in there that actually decreases retention. So it's really important that we make sure that SWOTs are conducted, but also reported, so we can add to that evidence base. The number of SWOTs has been increasing, but the range of SWOTs which are undertaken still remain largely disparate rather than coordinated. So as you can see here, between 2010 and 2020, we originally had, in the first iteration of the Cochrane Recruitment Review, 45 SWOTs, which increased to 68 in around 2018. And similarly, we see the same sorts of improvements, 38 up to 72, in the retention review between the 2 time points in which that was conducted. The increases of SWOTs are largely due to the impact of SWAT funding programmes and initiatives, so things like the MRC START, which was intended to develop interventions to enhance recruitment, Trial Forge, which is looking to systematically improve trial efficiency, the NIHR, the primary UK funder of health research, along with the HRB as the primary funder of health research. Those of you who are involved in the HRB TMN in terms of strengthening methodology and reporting of trials in Ireland, and with colleagues also similarly at ACT in Canada doing the same work. One other programme that has been undertaken is the Prometheus programme. This was funded by the MRC, the Medical Research Council, to us here at the University of York, to fund a programme of SWOTs in which we undertook 42 SWOTs, including simultaneous SWOTs such as the Christmas card. And it's this programme of work that's led to the development of the guideline that I'm going to talk to you about for the rest of the presentation today. So in terms of the importance of SWOT reporting, at York Trials Unit, we very much found that these are a really nice opportunity for early career researchers to lead a publication. It's a safe space in which to practice the craft of academic writing, and so is something that really should be encouraged, and I'm sure you do that already in your own practice. Just like with randomised controlled trials, transparent and timely reporting is important, but this doesn't always happen. It's particularly important in the use of SWATs because of the usual need, particularly where we're talking about individual or individual coordinated SWATs. There is a need to meta-analyse the results to allow us to establish sufficient power to detect the small effect sizes that the SWATs that we undertake do. And so that really does rely on the results of SWATs being reported and combined. Despite the relevance of transparent and timely reporting, as I say, this doesn't always happen. And sometimes these sorts of publications are the things that are abandoned in the face of other time pressures, which is perfectly understandable, but still it isn't right in terms of developing the literature base. There are previous guidelines for reporting embedded recruitment trials, but these, as far as we know, are not widely used. And also, in their very title, only focus on recruitment trials. Whilst there is applicability over to retention trials, there isn't currently a dedicated, or wasn't currently at the time that we conceived this project, a dedicated guideline for the reporting of embedded trials or SWATs. There is, of course, CONSORT reporting guidance for the reporting of clinical trials, and there are clearly elements within that are relevant to the reporting of studies within a trial. The CONSORT checklist is quite extensive and potentially therefore presents an additional burden for what is a relatively small study, particularly when we think about those time pressures that I mentioned a minute ago. So, why did we develop or decide to develop a SWOT reporting guideline? So within the Prometheus programme, working with these 42 different SWOTs across a similar number of host trials, we identified a number of reporting problems for SWOTs. So firstly, a lack of time and this not being a priority publication. So as many of you may have experienced, when study funding comes to an end, although you're still working on publications and dissemination, you're perhaps moving on to other projects, into that startup phase maybe again, and therefore your attentions have moved on to something else, which means it's difficult to find the time to write perhaps a lengthy publication around your study within a trial. There are also, in that critical point of finishing a trial, other competing demands of more key, in inverted commas, publications. The clinical results paper, will always be pushed to the fore, and therefore the SWOT publication maybe falls back a little bit. We also identified a lack of confidence and knowledge in terms of how to report SWOTs and where to go to publish a SWOT. And there are, we acknowledge, limited methodological journals, and those that are maybe available have article processing charges, which may not be covered by funding, and so may be difficult to get into open access publication. We also know from experience that those reviewing SWOTs, when submitted to a peer-reviewed publication, don't necessarily understand some of the nuances of studies within trials. For example, the need or not for patient consent, or information about the involvement in a SWOT are particularly pertinent in comments that we've received. Therefore, we felt that a straightforward, concise and consistent guideline for SWOTs was needed to aid not only authors, but also reviewers and journal editors throughout that whole dissemination process. So when we came to develop the guideline, we identified an initial proposal that was to make publishing studies within trials easier by developing a concise reporting guideline of 1,000 words or less. We felt that these would be simpler to write and potentially more cost effective because of the lower article processing charges that sometimes relate to lower word count. In order to help us determine if this was going to be feasible and practical to do, we developed a couple of SWOT publications, writing those in 1,000 words. One of these was a SWAT that was already in the process of being written up for publication. And one was a SWAT that had been previously published. So we could just understand a different perspective on the ability of writing in a more concise format. Once we developed these, the Prometheus group met, and that included both the Prometheus group, previous guideline authors, and a journal representative from BMC trials. We reviewed the example publications and agreed that the information that was contained whilst writing within a constrained word count was still sufficient to facilitate meta-analysis of a study within a trial. And therefore, we agreed to proceed with development of the guideline. To help us with further developing this, we met directly with the other guideline authors who had developed the reporting guideline for embedded recruitment studies, and agreed that any developed guideline would need to build on the increasing knowledge in the sector, particularly that coming from the information we were receiving from trial teams involved in the Prometheus programme, and also that we should be clear on the terminology that we would use. A draft reporting guideline was developed and was then re-reviewed. In developing the guideline, it became apparent that the 1,000-word limit that we had imposed was going to be too restrictive. It was largely ambitious and perhaps a little bit arbitrary. And we recognised that the reporting of complex studies within a trial within 1,000 words was just not going to be possible. We therefore agreed to drop the word count in favour of allowing some flexibility for authors. It was also identified during that drafting process that there was a real need to ensure that meta-analysis were being encouraged for second or subsequent SWAT replications. So we now have 2 studies that have undertaken the same study within a trial, and that then allows us to start a cumulative meta-analysis and to build that evidence replication by replication until we get to a point where we have some certainty around the estimate. And it's important that we standardise that so that we're continuing to build that evidence, given that things like your Cochrane reviews are not always, as up to date as they can be. So we revised the guideline again, and then moved on to registering this with the Equator guideline. That was available as a draft or in progress document. From here on in, we undertook pilot testing alongside the further steps in the development of the guideline. And we used a number of colleagues within the York Trials unit who were writing up studies within a trial of different complexities in different interventions and with different populations to test and feedback on how they found that. We also had the guideline adopted by the Research Methods in Medicine and Health Sciences journal for a SWAT special edition that they were running to again encourage individuals to use that and to test that a little bit with reviewers and the editors. In order to ensure that we had fully captured everyone's input to the guideline, we undertook a stakeholder review. So we contacted and had feedback from 5 UK and 1 international trial methodologist, of which the primary focus were based in academia rather than industry. And we also had participant and public involvement review. From this, we identified that providing a CONSORT style tabulation would help those who were unsure or lacking confidence in how to report studies, and that having exemplar wording so that we could almost pick off the shelf the words for a journal article would really help, particularly where there were time pressures around reporting. We also felt that it was useful to add additional clarification to improve grade certainty of reporting. So in looking at the Cochrane reviews, many studies within a trial were at low or medium grade certainty due to risk of bias, particularly due to the reporting of allocation concealment and sequence generation. And so we sought to improve those in order to help with the development of grade certainty in the future. We undertook then final pilot testing of the guideline in one recruitment and one retention SWAT to ensure that they were being able to be followed. Some of that was done by colleagues within the Prometheus team, and some of that was a little bit more independent. So we got, again, that diversity of input there. We made minor clarifications in that final stage, including addition of standard keywords to help with future systematic reviews of studies within a trial. From work that I and my colleagues have done, we know that it's incredibly difficult to locate studies within a trial easily in a literature search. So we hope that including a standardised set of words will help going forward. Given the increasing focus from funders on inclusivity, diversity and equality, we also sought to include Progress Plus criteria to enhance the reporting of EDI components and added that in the final stages of the guideline. That resulted in us having a final guideline that we were ready to share more broadly. So in summary, the guideline is designed for the use of reporting of randomised SWOT evaluations. We included 40 individual components which correspond in the main to CONSORT checklist items or items included in earlier reporting guidance. So a lot of this will be quite familiar to anyone using the guideline if they've worked in the clinical trials field before. We did include 4 new items. So 1, keywords, as I've just mentioned, to assist with systematic review terminology and searching going forward. The presentation of binary outcomes we also included to reflect that reporting of both absolute and relative effect sizes would be helpful for the ease of facilitating meta-analyses down the line. We also included a section on the costs of the study within a trial. So both in terms of thinking about the cost effectiveness, as we would routinely do in clinical trials, but also to help individuals considering replicating a SWOT to understand what the costs would be to them in order to undertake that replication. We felt that both were important, particularly given the stage that many of the SWOTs are at, in that they need further replication in order to reach a decision. But equally, the cost effectiveness combined with the end meta-analyses result is of equal importance in determining whether or not to use the intervention. We also included implications for practice and trial research, item 23, which very much focused authors on reviewing of cumulative analyses and consistency of findings and reflecting on the diversity of populations across the replications. One CONSORT item was also modified, the discussion item, to amend or reorder the structure to improve for reporting flow. So as you can see here on this slide, just a couple of examples of the guidance and example wordings that we've given here. So in the first column is the CONSORT number. Your second column is the CONSORT summary or the guideline summary, if those are additions that we've made. And then in this third and final column is your guidance and an example. So for example, if you were writing a SWOT publication, you could come to this guideline and instead of thinking how to write your objective, simply pick up the wording that is in italicized font, slot that in to your paper and amend to fit the study in the trial that you have done. Similarly, in the second example, so there's additional guidance there around the powering of or difficulties of powering studies within a trial and some of the justifications that may be useful to give in order to support that in a paper. So the SWOT reporting guideline has now been published, and hopefully that's now come up for you all to see. So this is available as Trial Forge Guidance 4 through the BMC trials, and links are available at the end of the presentation. So as you can see, this does, I appreciate at first view, look quite comprehensive, but actually what you need to remember is that a lot of the wording within this is guidance, or is text that is there for you to lift and use in your publication. So actually, when you come to use this, we hope isn't as daunting as it may appear, as I say, at first view. I'll just pause there just to allow you to just, take it in for just a moment, the guideline, if that's useful. Just moving back to the presentation, and yeah, as I say, the link is available at the end if you wish to, look at this in more detail after the presentation. So the strengths and limitations of the guideline. So firstly, it's adherent to CONSORT. We have used CONSORT as a basis in order to ensure that it is compliant there. The study is already or has been registered with the Equator Network. So the network is a repository of guidelines for those that are unfamiliar, for all different types of reporting. There was broad stakeholder input to the development of this, not only from those that are experienced in trial conduct and trials methodology, but also from external partners, as I've mentioned throughout the presentation. The perhaps disadvantage of the guideline as it stands is that this is for randomised SWATs only, and we appreciate that there are a number of SWATs that are undertaken that use non-randomised designs. The guidance is, however, we feel largely applicable to non-randomised SWATs with some clear modifications. For example, allocation, generation and concealment wouldn't be relevant for a non-randomised SWAT, but the general principles of the majority of components should still apply. So in terms of the next steps for the guideline, we'd really like to see routine use of this guideline going forward. So I would encourage those of you in this webinar today, if you have a SWAT in progress or are in the process of writing up, then please do consider using the guideline to help with this, and do please promote this amongst your colleagues who might also be undertaking or writing up studies within a trial. In terms of the Equator Network, so this, I realised when developing this presentation, does still sit within a in development section of the network. So we do need to now work with Equator to move that to finalised, so that everyone is aware of its availability and its finalisation. It would be really good to get this adopted by journals. As I mentioned, we have linked with the Research Methods in Medicine and Health for their special edition, but it would be useful to see this being used in other journals. And so we need to consider how we might facilitate that going forward. As a group here at the York Trials Unit, we are a Trial Forge SWAT centre, and therefore have other programmes of work ongoing that relate to studies within a trial at the moment. So we are beginning to think about other guidance that may be useful. As I mentioned before, this doesn't relate to non-randomised SWATs, so there may be a need for us to think about adaptation for non-randomised SWATs. And There is also current work ongoing to think about SWAT protocols. So we will be developing a number of protocols for key SWAT strategies that we view to be a priority through some work done by the Trial Forge SWAT network. And there is a suggestion thereafter that we may consider guidance for trial protocols as well. So we would be interested to know from attendees if they would be useful. So in conclusion, SWATs, as I'm sure you know, play a key role in improving trial process evidence base. Their results do need to be made publicly available and promptly to ensure that we are able to use the best evidence to guide our decisions in trial design and to accumulate that evidence through meta-analyses to reach a definitive conclusion. The guideline that we have developed, we hope will aid authors, reviewers and journal editors to produce clear, structured reports of SWATs whilst also adhering to CONSORT. And therefore, we would very much encourage all attendees and colleagues beyond to use this guideline when publishing SWATs. Just as we always do, just to acknowledge the Prometheus programme funded by the Medical Research Council, who were the funding that supported the inception of this work. And just to also thank the members of the Prometheus programme for their contributions, public contributors and stakeholders who helped us with feedback and input during the study, along with the authors of previous reporting guidelines, and also the reviewers and trialists who reported on and piloted early iterations of the guideline. Without their input, all of their input, this would have been difficult to facilitate. And so finally, there are some references there should you need. So the first of those there is your Trial Forge guidance for a guideline for the reporting of the results of studies. And the other references are those that I have referenced or spoken about as we've moved through the presentation. So at that stage, I will stop and we can take any questions.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Someone had asked for the link and I've just posted it there in the webinar chat box for everyone to see. I've also posted the link to the post-webinar feedback form that attendees can fill out, but they will also receive that in an email from us if they'd like to. But my second post in the chat there is the link to the paper. So I do have a question here that's just come in. It says, are SWAT protocols routinely published? Do you publish SWAT protocols at York CTU? Do you register the SWAT protocols? And I see Mairead Keneally has just posted, I think, probably one protocol that has been published. But I don't know if you have anything further to say to that, Catherine.
It's a bit yes and no. So some studies or some SWATs do write a protocol and publish this, and there are a number that are available in the literature. But generally speaking, the trend seems to be that they aren't reported as a peer-reviewed publication. I suspect that some of that is, the time needed to develop that publication and also the funding that goes with that. And certainly I know in the UK, the move of the National Institute for Health Research to a more threaded publication where publications are the cornerstones of a final report may, change that landscape a little bit. But whether it's right or wrong to publish a SWAT protocol, I mean, clearly it's important to make people aware of the work that you're doing, but whether that's feasible or not will very much be within the remit of an individual trial. Even without a peer-reviewed publication, we would always encourage trialists to register their studies within a trial in the SWAT repository hosted by Queen's at Belfast, and that provides a nice resource to register what the SWAT is, and also, I guess, to check for duplication if there are other SWATs that have already been registered that are very similar. It affords the opportunity for linkage of meta-analyses. I should just also take that opportunity to say that with the repository, the Trial Forge SWAT network have identified that the lack of resources available, so developed protocols, appendices to main trial protocols, if there is a SWAT appendices, copies of interventions, copies of publications, is largely missing from that repository. And so we have been doing some work that is still ongoing to make those available through the Trial Forge website. So hopefully that will help in terms of registration and onward conduct going forward.